Hi, folks. Welcome. Thank you so much. I hope you all had an awesome Connect, but thank you for coming out to this last panel block. We're going to talk about accessibility design today. My name's Ted DiNola. I'm part of our developer relations engineering team as part of our third-party content team. So I get to work with lots of amazing developers to bring their games to the Quest store, giving deep dive technical and design feedback. And one of my passions has been helping developers think early and often about accessibility. Today, I'd like to introduce two amazing developers from our space. First up, Jasmine Kano from Owlchemy. Oh, there's a title slide there. Hold on, bring it on in. There we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Kano, Accessibility Product Manager at Owlchemy Labs. You might know Owlchemy Labs from our games such as Job Simulator, Vacation Simulator, and Cosmonious High. And if you're not too aware, Cosmonious High takes place in this alien high school that's super cute, full of characters and fun objects. And they're in a bit of trouble and need your help. So in the game, you use your hands to help them out with some powers that you got.
Fantastic. And Rafen from Aldin Dynamics.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Aldin. We've been in the space for close to a decade. And have been pushing really hard on innovation throughout the years. And our flagship title is Walls of the Wizard, which is a magic experience where our key goal is sort of to give you a natural experience of having magical powers and actually feeling like you have them and making it work like what you can imagine if you're watching the movies where people just speak a word and wave a hand and snap their fingers and things happen. So.
All right. Well, welcome. Thank you both so much for coming out here today. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk through a bunch of different questions to kind of frame the journey that these folks have gone through as they, went from thinking about accessibility to building it into their studio as a practice. So we'll kick off with that first question right here, which is what accessibility features have you included in your projects and what inspired you to start building them? Jasmine, if you want to kick it off.
Yeah, I got a long list. So our games have a lot of accessibility features, including one-handed mode. There's small human mode. We also have subtitles. And in Cosmonious High, we added vision accessibility, which I'll be talking about a lot today. I'll explain what that is now. In this update, we've added the ability for players with low vision and legal blindness to be able to hear object descriptions, teleportation descriptions. That way, if someone isn't able to see clearly what's around, they can hear it through text-to-speech, or TTS. And that's done by aiming their palm at an object or an area, and then hearing what it is that's there, where they're going. Now, for the inspiration. Owlchemy Labs believes in VR for everyone, and with each game that comes out, there are accessibility features. And when it came to Cosmonious High's accessibility feature for vision, we looked at what was out there when it came to accessibility in games. And vision accessibility was an area that wasn't explored much, so why not?
Especially in VR.
Especially in VR, that's so true. So that was the inspiration. It's trying to figure out if we can do something there, and we did, and it's been amazing. I have a quick story to share about that.
Yeah,
so in one of our playtests, we had someone who purchased the game already, and he got stuck maybe in the first 5 minutes of playing, immediately faced a barrier because he couldn't see this key that turns on the bus to get to school. So he didn't even get to go to school.
That sounds really sad.
It gets better, though. Like, it gets happy, not sad.
That's good to hear.
So with this feature, in that part of the game where he got stuck, he was scanning the room and heard key. Heard the description for the key, was like, oh, well, there it is. Plugged it in the bus, went straight to school, and continued to play for 40 minutes, going to classes, doing the assignments, earning credits. And I was like, I love that you're having fun, but your playtest is up, and I would love to talk to you about your experience. So he had a great time, and it made me so happy to know that the work we've done actually helps players enjoy the game.
That's fantastic to hear because, so many times, as developers here in the audience or as new developers in the space, it's so important to make sure that players are able to progress through your environment and experience what's going on. But when you're not hearing impaired or vision impaired, when you don't deal with these issues, you don't realize that the cues that you're using might not work for everyone. So if you just have a key in the world, that might be a really big signifier for people that have full vision, but you've just excluded a huge number of players. If you're using just audio to cue alone on the other side, same thing. People that have limited hearing, that's not going to work for them. So I'm happy that you were able to give them such a good experience and have them able to, go to school. Raven, why don't you talk about some of the stuff you guys have worked on and your inspiration as well?
Sure. I think the stuff that you're doing on vision is really interesting. Like there's a lot of emphasis on like hearing impairment and stuff, but in VR, like where it's such a visual medium, it often gets left out. Like what about those who don't maybe see as well? But yeah, like we've done a bunch of things. Like to mention something, like for hand tracking, we introduced like a missing finger mode. Like if you have a missing finger or finger impairment where your movement isn't fully able to move your finger, you can pair that with the movement of another finger. So that for like computer vision where it can't actually see your finger or stuff, it gets annoying, and you can simulate it if you just try to use hand tracking with your finger down. And that actually just started out as one person like reached out and like I don't have these fingers here, and so there's something to be done about that. But after we released it, we've had a lot of or quite a few others actually mentioned the same issues. And so in some cases, I think there's surprising amount of people that are silently suffering. And I think there's a lot that you can do to address that stuff. But yeah,
You said an interesting point there, which is this silently suffering thing, which is that a lot of times when players don't see a feature available, whether it's accessibility or whatever that might be, they rather than tell you that they expect it or ask for it, they just assume it's not a possibility. And so if you and your team aren't being proactive, thinking about ways that you're able to improve access to your titles, you might never know that they want to play or that there's ways that you could help them play. So that's good to hear you mention that.
We've also done like a bunch of voice interaction features where you can change the world around you and settings and like say, make me this tall or change the audio levels of certain enemies or like there's a lot that you can do with voice interaction that sort of makes the effort or the bar a lot lower for like altering settings that might increase the accessibility for diverse audiences. But yeah, in terms of like the inspiration for this, like we firmly believe that VR and AR can be the most accessible medium that's ever been created and that we can ever create if you design it right. And we think if you design things in a way that allows people to do things in their own personal way, the way that they prefer, that can be the most empowering thing that you can experience in any sort of medium. And so that's kind of ingrained in us to think about all the different ways that a person can interact, and try to enable as much of that as possible. And so like using the combination of voice and hands and just the natural interaction and then trying to figure out what are the different types of people and what do they share in common? Like what are the things that most people do and the way that they most interact and what are the outliers? I think there's a lot that you can gain from that, like not just addressing like minority groups, but also empowering just your whole range of audience by thinking about those things.
That's something I often talk about when I'm thinking about accessibility and accommodations across the board is there's this theme within tech, within product, which is, the idea of minimizing harm. And that is a very noble goal. But you always have the opportunity to go beyond that. How can you not just minimize harm, but how can you give people an experience they can't have anywhere else? How can you give them superpowers? How can you treat them with huge amounts of respect and give them, abilities or access that they can't get through any other experience? Let's dig a little bit deeper and talk about kind of the process of starting to think about this, starting to think about building out features. So what are some assumptions you started with when you were building some of these features? that were challenged. How did you identify those things, and how did you address those?
Yeah, let me talk about the vision accessibility update, specifically the ability to hear the descriptions from objects. So if anyone here has used a text-to-speech software on a computer or a phone, you know that a cursor will be placed somewhere on the page and read out what is said. So we assumed maybe if we give the players the ability to hear the description of where their hands are pointing, like making their hands the cursor, that would feel similar enough and intuitive enough. However, in an alchemy game where we have hundreds of objects around you and it's very immersive, many characters are also like speaking and guiding you through this story, it could be overwhelming when hands are automatically reading out descriptions. It was very hard to understand what was going on as soon as someone's hand went this way and scooted over a little. Maybe the other hand pointed somewhere else because you're hearing different audio going over each other. That did not work in VR. It's very different. So
I can imagine also, as you're passing through, you're like, wait, where was I'm looking for no, but it was back here.
Yes, it was very cringy for that first playtest. We knew we had to design it differently for VR, so we gave people control over when they hear the description. We assigned a button as the accessibility button.
I love the idea of an accessibility button. I think that's brilliant, and you should all build that into your game somewhere.
So when a player selects the accessibility button over an object, they hear the description. Also, you were talking about, where is the thing? We've added haptics as well, so players know when their hand is going from one object to another. We also added a lot more, so highlights as well on key objects. That way people can get different cues to what's around and what's important in the game.
You mentioned something so key here, which is the importance of using multiple types of cueing whenever possible. As I said earlier, if you just rely on visual or just audio or just haptic, you're limiting the audience available to you, but also when you combine them, it really reinforces it. It makes it super easy to understand your world regardless of your hearing or vision capacity or cognitive ability, etc. Anything else, Raven? Should we go on to Raven?
Do you guys encourage a big part of the company to try out all these accessibility features and gather feedback there? Or?
Thank you for asking. Yes, absolutely. We're always thinking about it in the design stages very early on, and we're testing what we're making. We also have some internal tools that we use. So Peter Galbraith is one of our accessibility engineers, and he created this, it's sort of like a window in the engine that lets you have a simulated vision deficiency. So there's different levels of blur you can select and have a simulated vision that's blurred a little, blurred a bit more, very blurry where you absolutely need these features, and also total vision loss. So there are different ways we test. We test just when working on it in production and also with these tools. And if you have a diverse team, you'll have a lot of diverse feedback, and that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this is the feedback I get to developers often, which is things like, a play your game with no sound. Is it playable, or is there something missed? Play your game in black and white if you can do that. Does everything make sense? Is all understandable? Playing your game with blur modes, I haven't seen anyone else do that before, and I think it's a brilliant way to be able to put yourself in the shoes of your players and make sure that your systems are actually doing what you expect them to do. Great.
It helps so much when designing. That way when you get to play testing with people who have legal blindness or have low vision, then you've already solved for that low-hanging fruit, and you're getting the very important feedback to iterate on. Thank you for asking.
You're welcome. So in terms of to get back to the question, some assumption, there's one assumption that, we had our suspicions about, but we're delightfully surprised to see it work out. Most of the stuff that's going on today is controller based, and hand tracking is making its way towards broader adoption. But there was an important note that it sounds simpler and more accessible to have this controller that everybody knows, and where the button is, and But it turns out, like, if you design things correctly around hand tracking, people are going to find that more natural instantly, if you have the right design. Otherwise, you're going to put this burden on people to learn the different button combinations and then remember where those buttons are. And, that is just putting the burden on the user. And you can actually relieve all of that burden of the user if you design things in a way that accommodates the most likely behaviors you would have if you have like your natural hands. And this comes back to like what is the core thing in designing an accessible reality experience, because we all know how to interact in reality, and if you approximate that as much as you can, people are going to be able to interact more naturally, and the broader audiences are going to instantly get it. And so like for us, we see that as an opportunity that sort of we prove to ourselves internally is a mode of thinking that can both empower our users and make it more accessible for everyone. You have to like think about all the different ways that people interact and behave, and that sounds like a really complicated thing, but it's also complicated figuring out how do I make this simple controller work for everything and mediate all of that information. So I'm pointing out that it's a sneaky amount of work making that controller work when you could just alter the world to make it more like reality, and thinking about how that user experience is.
I think, speaking of, meeting the players where they're at, you've also talked about kind of, I don't want to overload the term multimodal, since we announced we're doing that for hand tracking controllers, but multimodal inputs. So making sure, like, seeing how players do an interaction and then letting them do it multiple ways, letting them find the way to do that. Have you found that players appreciate and use that, and how often do you use that approach?
Absolutely. And like the latest thing, like big thing we introduced to the whole design of Waltz of the Wizard was adding voice interaction. And at that point, we now have gestures where you can naturally interact. We have the hands, just the natural hands, and now the voice part. When this all starts working together, that's when people start to behave in ways that you would expect if it were reality. So they start talking naturally, they start feeling more natural, they stop freezing up as much because they're trying to figure out which buttons to push. They start just acting more like they would in reality. And the best part about that is that at that point, you just have to think, okay, what would a normal person do if this were real? That doesn't maybe work in all cases, like when you have something like magic, like in our case. You have to think around it a bit, but then you can always think like, okay, what would they expect it to work like in the movies? And at that point, like, yeah, you'd say some words, you wave your hand, you wiggle your fingers. Like, so multimodal gets us closer to that sense of reality. And that sort of makes it easier to design the world.
Absolutely. Let's move on to our next little topic here. So we talked a little bit about getting past hurdles, but and actually a little bit you've dug in already to this next question, which is how are you testing and iterating when you're building these features out? Especially, how are you finding people to make sure that your assumptions are valid, to make sure that the systems are working for your target audience? Jasmine, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so earlier we talked about testing internally. We also test externally, and we've been working with VR Oxygen. They're a group that's been able to help us find players with disabilities that can test, and we do this remotely over Zoom. So we're watching players play, like that story earlier. It's very fun.
What's the process of working with VR Oxygen like?
We give them a description of a profile for the type of player we're looking for, some requirements around which hardware they would need, and a description of how we would run those tests, and additionally, how we'll pay people for their time. And that's very important for accessibility work. It's very, very important to pay your play testers. So we do testing that way, and the process for us after a playtest is we get the feedback. I bring that feedback back to the team. We discuss what we learned and what we could iterate on and improve, and just keep doing that cycle.
I believe you also reached out to a subject matter expert within the blind gaming community. Is that correct?
That is correct. So we worked with Steve Saylor early on. You may know him as Blind Gamer Steve. And with Steve, we created a list, sort of like a ideal feature list for this update. And additionally, we worked with other accessibility consultants that have been working on games, not VR games, but other, the pancake games.
It is obviously VR does have its own specific considerations, especially with physical mobility and the fact that you're dealing with a volumetric environment. But, tried and true accessibility accommodations are still super valuable here.
We learned so much, and we continue to do testing even after this update has come out. And I think that's very important for all teams to do. Once your game is launched, accessibility is not something to just stop working on. You have to keep going. It never ends. And so we're doing these interview sessions and getting feedback even after.
Fantastic. And Ravin, what has your experience been like with, just making sure that these are being proven out?
We really early on, we started integrating it just into our formal development process to test out on a constant and regular basis to a much higher degree than if we were creating monitor content. And also an important part of that is just encouraging the mentality to try as much as you can, your developers, try the many different ways that things could either break or be done in different ways, and just keep that as a mode of thinking. But at this point, we're collaborating with schools in our neighborhood, and getting students in, and we categorically try to seek out various different physical traits, body types, backgrounds, whether it's gaming or a regular person who doesn't game at all. Regular person.
There is no regular person, Ravin.
All right, but yeah, but we try to get all these different types, and of course, when you have the different things like controllers and hand tracking and voice and stuff, you also try to target out different accents and try to try out all those different modes. But this is a bit of an extra work, and we have a dedicated person that's just managing getting people for 2 or 3 playtest sessions per week on a regular ongoing basis. Then we review all that afterwards. And it's worth mentioning also that we thought this has been so important to do that we even created a tool that's sort of a physical analysis testing tools, just to ensure that lets us compare, all right, are people of a certain height doing different things in the experience? It's sort of like analytics, but this, we thought it was that important, just figuring out how are people physically behaving when they're in this world. When there's an audio cue, are people looking that way or not? And this can be done with a tool, or you can do that with manual observation. But in any case, I strongly urge everyone to do that as frequently as you can.
So what we've talked about so far is building accessibility is a whole lot of work, but let's get to the positive sides, because there are a lot of positive outcomes from putting this work in. I would argue you probably get a lot more out of it than you put in. I'd love to hear what your personal outcomes have been. Jasmine, I know that you have had some major usage for your audio assistance.
I am very excited to share that this week we learned over 9.1 million requests have come in for that text-to-speech description, and Cosmonia is high.
That's a lot of people using the system.
Congrats.
Thank you. Additionally, that's only on Quest 2. So that's just numbers from one platform. We're also on other platforms, and I can imagine similar numbers there. So that tells us people are using this feature, and they're using it a lot. And just to describe what a request means when I say that, it's every time someone wants to get a description, they press that accessibility button. Also, when a player is teleporting and they want to hear the description of where they might travel to, that's a request. And so that means people are using it a lot to get through the game and enjoy it.
Have you gotten much feedback on the system from people that are using it?
We've gotten a lot of great feedback, a lot of people thanking us, and a lot of comments about how there's not enough accessible games out there. I know we're trying to make it positive. So I'm so glad
I mean, it's a bit of a differentiator for you, isn't it?
I'm so glad everyone's here, because if you're here, I believe you're making your content accessible. And the more content that is accessible out there, the more people feel welcome to come play VR games. And everyone should have the opportunity to experience VR, to experience the magic.
Well, and do you think there were players that are able to play now that probably weren't able to before? I mean, you had your story at the start.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that on social media too, we're getting a lot of messages as well that are very positive and thanking the team. So I know that it just proves that a lot of more teams need to add accessibility to their games, because they'll see more usage, they'll have people coming and thanking them, and then there'll be more awareness of your games, because we need more accessible games in the space.
Absolutely. Yeah, Raven, yeah, pick on up.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of work, but it pays off in multiples when it comes to, like, not just for like minority groups or something. It pays off when you focus more on like the physical experience and making it accessible for as many people as possible. That's also what happens. Like, the experience becomes more compelling. Like, it's not as optional, this way of thinking, as it is for like monitors. When you think and focus on these things, it's going to pay off for your regular average user, as well as enabling it for broader audiences.
Great example, of course, is modern statistics on captions usage, and we've seen some really great high quality. Once again, I would call out Owlchemy's captions are fantastic. People watching television and movies that they have no impairment, but they use captions because it makes it easier to understand. And so the same thing, when you give people better physical choices, give people audio assist choices, the more options you give players, everyone uses them. Some people need to use them and it makes the experience possible to use. Some people, they're like, this enriches my experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like in like Aldin and Owlchemy share a lot of philosophy in common. And I think what you can, like, in terms of what the outcomes are, I think, is that, you can almost throw anyone into these experiences that are designed with a great focus on accessibility. And they're going to enjoy it. They're going to smile. They're not going to grow confused as much as when you design it like with a lesser emphasis on it. And so that's where I think it pays off a lot for our content, and I think Owlchemy as well. Like, it becomes such a natural experience for anyone to step into and interact.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about building this into the culture of your team. So, how has thinking about accessibility changed the way you plan for and work in your projects? When do you start thinking about it? When do you stop? If you stop, exactly. We'll let Jasmine kick it off again.
You don't stop. Don't stop thinking about accessibility ever. I would say the way accessibility applies to Owlchemy, it is part of the culture. You mentioned culture. I know it's talked about in job interviews. It's in the developer guidelines. It's talked about during our playtest, during design, and of course, every time we launch an update, we're getting that feedback, so we're talking about it afterwards. Like I said, accessibility never stops. So we're thinking about it as early as possible. Even just when we get some sketches, some ideas, we're thinking about that. We also have a dedicated team at Owlchemy for accessibility, which I recommend all teams do if you can.
Would you say accessibility is a core pillar for you?
Absolutely. Yes, VR for everyone. We have shirts that say that. They're very cute.
When we go to sleep at night, we dream about accessibility.
Some weird dreams there, but I appreciate it though.
No, but I just say the same thing. Like, we try to think about this on an ongoing basis all of the time. And it's the sort of thing that's so easy to overlook, or easy to overlook an opportunity to make things simple. And, there's this saying, like, in making things intuitive seems like it's so easy, but it's actually the hard part. And you know, that's why it's so important to be thinking about this on an ongoing basis, because you often overlook ways to make things simpler for everyone.
Players
Or
will
more
always
intuitive.
players will always exceed your expectations in surprising ways, and so
Yeah, absolutely.
you need to meet them where they're at and provide.
Absolutely. And you can relieve some of that thought workload by doing more user testing and just having it proven out. Like, is it working in the way I expected?
Fantastic. Well, before we have kind of our closing topic, we're going to open up the floor briefly for some Q&A. So if folks have any thoughts, any questions, step on up. There's a microphone over here and over there. Apologies to folks watching on the live stream. We don't have a way to hear your questions, but hopefully some of these folks will have some good ones for us. So we'll start on our left. Introduce yourself and share your question.
Hi, I'm Yasmina, VR dev working for Fruity Systems. First of all, thank you very much for the work that you do. I think it's really, really important. I had a bit of a fun question for you, a bit blue skies thinking. I know we just looked yesterday at what the new generation of Oculus will look like, and a lot of the times people focus on better graphics and things like that, color pass-through, which, especially in the case of visual impairment, won't really offer a lot for people that are struggling with that in terms of accessibility. What is something you would like to see in the next generation of VR that would improve developing with accessibility in mind for you?
Fantastic. I'd love to hear the developers' thoughts. And then also, we do have some folks from engineering comms that maybe they can talk a little bit about what our roadmap looks like, just a little bit. So, Jasmine and Rafid, what are you looking for in this space?
I love this blue sky question. So something that comes to mind. Yes. Something that comes to mind immediately is descriptions in the game. So like I said earlier, there's a lot of objects around. We saw that the glasses can tell you what it is that you're looking at. So if VR developers could have something like that in their games, in these immersive 3D spaces where the technology tells the player what it is they're looking at, that would help a lot of teams make their content more accessible, because they might be saving some time and resources instead of manually authoring these descriptions like we did.
Absolutely.
And that would speed things up. And I think, again, it would make more content more accessible and welcoming for people.
Thank you.
I think honestly more data about the player, like as in more ways to understand the physical user experience is something that's very important. And it was announced today, I believe somewhere, that there's better body tracking coming to Quest 3 and beyond.
Body tracking is something we very much care about, yeah.
It's super important, and that can enable so many new different things, as well as ways for us developers to better understand the physical user experience, like beyond just new features that you can add. It can tell you things about what's going on with the user or what kind of user it is. Yeah.
And then for my part, I was part of the process along with Marie Kyle, who's a producer with our content team, building out our accessibility VRCs. So if you're a developer and you've gone through our QA process, you've seen our accessibility VRCs, which are soft. They're not required, although they're strongly recommended. And that's because we realized the work that goes out into building accessibility features. One of my hopes is that as we continue to build more system-level accessibility features, things like captioning, things like the already released tone mapping that helps with colorblindness, that we can make these features hard requirements where I can say to developers, hey, we're going to do the work for you. And if you don't want to use our features, that's fine, but you need to match or exceed what we do. If we could do that, I would be thrilled, because it would mean that all of our games would have a baseline level accessibility accommodations, which, would be just an incredible incredible gift to our community.
I would be
right.
so thrilled too.
We obviously have to take into account the limitations of compute, the limitations of engineering resources, but we have a lot of great people within Meta that care strongly about accessibility and that are building things out, trying to find ways to make these devices more accessible every single day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for your question. All right, introduce yourself and please share your question.
Yeah, my name is Patrick Owens. I'm from Buffalo, Buffalo, and
Oh, Buffalo, 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 Buffalo.
yeah, that's actually nice.
If you don't know the reference, you're
Yeah,
not enough
don't
of a
worry about
language
it. You're
nerd.
not missing much. Actually, no, you should Wikipedia. It's pretty cool. Anyways, so outside of my day job, I actually used to teach at NYU's. Like they had a boot camp for XR design, and one of the topics we would talk about a lot is accessibility and inclusivity. You know, I'm one of the guys who dreams about this sort of stuff a lot for sure. We're a pretty small team. We have a few like full-time members and a few contractors. And there's kind of this question that I still struggle with. I've never really found the answer to, which is like, when I look at games like, AAA games like Naughty Dog games, like their accessibility options are amazing. And it really is like, for everyone. You can play those games literally, without vision sometimes these days. But when you have limited resources, it's always like, how much accessibility is enough, and like, how do you decide how far you should keep going essentially, and is there a rubric of what things we should be hitting exactly? Like, it's kind of a vague question, but it's like something, I haven't really figured out myself. So just wanted to see if you guys had any thoughts.
I think that's a great question.
It's a hard question. I have a recommendation, which is there are some amazing sites that focus on these resources, and there are also amazing experts that you can hire to give you this feedback as consult, because from my opinion, an accessibility miss is the same as a feature miss, right? And obviously, we do not have time as developers to make everything in our games perfect. We have to accept that sometimes we're going to miss the mark. But you should very strongly consider those things, and you should make sure you're armed and informed with what is possible so you can plan early. And then when you need to sacrifice it, it's not we didn't consider it. It is a miss. I don't know how you two feel about that. But for me, take advantage of the resources out there. Find out what is possible. Find out ways that you can speed up. There might be something that you think is very difficult, but there's a good third-party solution available to you. Do the due diligence.
Yeah, I would echo that. If there's no accessibility at all, it's not finished.
I mean, if you ship a AAA game and your accessibility menu is blank, that people are going to note it in reviews. I'm not mentioning any titles at all.
I think this is something that, have to evaluate on a team basis, like what are your resources, but there are some lines that we've found are helpful as guidelines, like if 30% of users are encountering an issue, or there's a chance of somewhere between 20 to 30, I would call that definitely worth doing, because there's a bunch of issues like that, just in general, that you're going to, that number was something that we sort of figured was a good thing to keep in mind. But yeah, I would just recommend, using common sense and figuring it out depending on, I wish there was a simple answer to this, but.
Left-handed mode.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Please.
Sure.
Lefties, raise your hands. That's about on track with the curve. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for your question. All right, and our final question, and then we'll go back to our final question. So please, your name and your question, where you're from, what you do.
Name's Chris Walls. Company is called Doge Labs, after the meme. And
To the moon?
To the moon, yeah. And the company, or the game, it's a VR sports game. It's called Big Ballers VR. Got basketball, football, all kinds of sports. First, I was just going to share a little story, which is that we tried to make our game so that you could play it even if you're sitting down. And one of our fans was a huge basketball fan, and ended up losing the ability to walk. And he thanks me all the time for creating the game and being able to play while being seated or in a wheelchair. So it's really rewarding to hear things like that. The question I had is about motion sickness. I feel like that's the biggest problem, with VR, or one of the biggest challenges with accessibility in VR. Curious your thoughts on that. Like for our game, we felt like we had to use smooth locomotion, but we wish we had like other sort of ways to compensate for the motion sickness that some of our users have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this best practice guidance is that we thankfully, getting around motion sickness is a solved problem these days. It's about minimizing vection. There's lots of comfort mechanics you can put in. But if you're doing a multiplayer game with locomotion, you might be like, well, how do we make it so we don't have one player teleporting around and one moving? There's some great games that have found solves for this. I'd recommend just look around through some of our modern multiplayer games. A lot of them do things like, a mode where the character model moves through that space, and you're still getting, as a player, you're getting the comfort, but from a third-person perspective, they look like they're moving naturalistically. Some people have done things like third-person control, where when you press forward, you're controlling someone without moving yourself, so you don't have that vection problem. And then once you release, you immediately teleport there. There are definitely solves for this. Multiplayer is one of the spaces where I see a lot of folks compromising on their accessibility because they're like, how do I make this work? And that's going to be a problem if you don't start thinking about it at the start. If you try to add accessibility towards the end, you'll have made hard decisions that are going to be incompatible with certain groups of players. Any thoughts from either of you on that one, or?
That's why we use teleportation for comfort.
Yeah, we offer different options in our case, but we try to design things so that they're enjoyable without locomotion. But that has to be done on a case-by-case basis.
I have an iron stomach. I'm smooth locomotion, smooth turning. I'm basically surfing through VR, but I am not a typical case, I don't think. All right.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Great.
it.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's close this out with some good advice from our two experts here. What advice would you give to developers like some of these folks who are looking to build with accessibility in mind?
If you haven't started, just start somewhere. We did have the question earlier about prioritization. Which one do you choose? Like, which features do you choose? I feel like as long as you're making progress, you're helping, you're welcoming more people. I keep saying that, but we want to share this fun experience and have more people in this space. So start somewhere, look at what's possible, talk to your team, and also look at those VRCs for accessibility. Use the resources that are out there. And like we've mentioned before, don't stop.
Don't stop. Fantastic. And Raven, some sage advice, please.
Yeah. So there's one thing that we've sort of learned over the years is we addressed before, there's sometimes effort involved in this, and not all of us have a big team or the time to really put effort into stuff, for smaller groups. But we found that in many cases, some of these features can be made in a way that makes it fun and interesting for everyone. So, in our case, the voice interaction features, we wanted to add some magic that you can do with a voice. And then we figured, hey, let's make people able to change more in the world that would make this, make people able to customize the experience for themselves. That was an accessibility feature that helps more people play our stuff, but is also a key fun feature for everyone. And I mentioned this before when we were talking, but in your case, you're making a blurry simulator to feel what it's like. But that sounds like something that could be fun for someone to try, just as a silly little feature that you could include, for the blurry mode, and kids might find it fun to see what that's like. So my point is that you can make features that add value to broader audiences, while also enabling, smaller groups of people to experience the game, your worlds more accessibly.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to take a moment to thank our two speakers, Jasmine and Raf, for coming out. Also, we had a third panelist who sadly got sick before today, and so he wasn't able to come out, Thomas Vanbo. He's been doing some amazing work with thinking about physical accessibility in the upcoming title Laser Dance, which how do you have multiple supports for mobility, across a room? So very cool stuff there. Definitely take a look. Strongly recommend taking a look at Owlchemy's games and Aldin Games for some great examples of accessibility in the features they talked about. And thank you so much for coming on out to this. I think this is your last panel at Connect. And thank you to everyone that tuned in online.